in thinking about creativity, my experience has told me that it is so incredibly important to understand that this is not a solo performance. You have to have the balancing side. You cannot simply be creative without cutting it with truth. You might, as an artist, be able to create something that's cathartic for you, but other people won't see it as much because it won't touch on a truth that connects us. So that has to be there.
Welcome to Architecture, Design, and Photography. Today I'm in the host seat. My name is Joel Kuschke. I'm the creative director for Advocate Media USA, where I oversee Maine Magazine and Maine Home+Design. I've been working in the design field for about 15 years. I earned a BFA in expanded media from Alfred University in New York, and then returned to my home state of Maine, where I get to go outside and enjoy all sorts of cool things like camping and fishing. Today we're speaking with Trent Bell, an architectural photographer based in Biddeford, Maine. Trent graduated from Andrews University with a master's degree in architecture in 2003. He started a design firm with his partner, but after 3 years, he wasn't finding the fulfillment in his career that he'd expected, so he chose to pursue architectural and commercial photography and built a business in southern Maine that soon expanded throughout New England, to New York and beyond. In addition to the photography, Bell does short film productions for both architectural and commercial advertisements. Trent is also drawn towards wrestling with our purpose and meaning. Our interview today is sponsored by Maine Home+Design. Don't miss Trent's design theory in the upcoming August issue of Maine Home+Design. Thank you for coming to the studio today and having me.
It's where I work. You're the one who invited me here, not me. Come on.
Happy Friday.
Hold on a second. What is the outside input I'm getting here? That's fine. That's fine.
Okay,
this is about the conversation. Thank you, though. Sorry, we have our producer off set here.
Good deal. So today we're talking about creativity. So I guess let's just start with the basics, and maybe the hardest question, though. How do you define creativity, and why is it important?
Well, I told Danielle I'd have like a draft of what I'm trying to write about, like I think a week ago, and
Sure.
I'm still like halfway through it. It's so hard to
It's surprisingly hard
define
subject.
it. It's so weird because we are like fish in water to creativity. Like the creative, I would define it more as the creative cycle, which requires both what we would term creative individuals, but then also there's a balancing act to that there's people that have more of a concept of and a reliance on and a positive emotional experience with reliable, consistent truths. Okay. So creativity is the ability to create something. What is a creation? It is something new. It is something new, novel, and of some value. At minimum, to the person creating it, it can be cathartic, like a work of art that simply no one else appreciates, but it was worth something for that person. Or a creation can be a problem-solving thing, effective on a more mass scale. So this idea of like creativity comes from the process of essentially solving problems. And that ability to define a problem and work towards a solution is usually easier for those who have a more broad range of experience through experience, right? Like obvious, but and that ability of being able to see things from a relative position and move your perspective around and to maintain curiosity in a positive emotional presence, right? So after a full day of doing concrete things like emails, invoicing, and estimates, which estimate doesn't sound concrete, but after a full day of doing concrete things, I am wiped out. And it's weird. I ramp myself up into an almost manic state of like focus, and it feels very unnatural to me. And I'll have just a raging headache by the end of the day. Whereas if I'm working creatively, it's just something that comes natural. And by the end of the day, I'm exhausted, but it's like, boy, that felt good. You know,
Sure.
It's like it's more of a little bit more of a manual labor, kind of tired of like I accomplished something, where concrete tasks to me that don't involve creativity feel more like I'm in more of a what's that they say when you under duress.
Sure.
I'm like
Yes.
under duress to accomplish these things rather. So, you know, creativity to me is the natural ability of problem solving. So a natural talent of problem solving, I would say. And that comes from a grasp of a wide range of knowledge through experience to then be able to articulate those things into a more concrete reality. So people who are attuned to experiencing and interacting with chaos and abstract things, who receive a positive emotional state from interacting with that, which will burn you up after time, which tells you need to go back to the realm of reliable order that is established and maintained by people of a more conscientious disposition. So you have to go back to the medieval walls, if you will, to then be able to leave the medieval walls into the unknown, to create more bricks, to bring back, to build more reliable safety and structure to help us keep going forward. It's that interrelation of both the conservatives and the liberals, the feminine and the masculine, the open and the conscientious, all of those things. Very interestingly to me, the priests and the prophets. Prophets are the ones with like that have all the stereotypes of the artistic, you know, like wearing. I think you've probably heard of John the Baptist if you were, you know, in a Christian environment
Sure.
at all. You know, some wild-haired locust and honey eating, barely dressed freak artist, creative type. You get it. Out on the fringes of reality that comes back in once in a while and yells things at you that they've perceived that the rest of the people haven't, in the form of art or creation. Or it's the same thing, that there's this experience that can speak into reality, and there's personality types that are attuned to being able to do that, to speaking that truth into existence. But then it takes a highly tuned and someone who has to work against a resisting force to make sure that what they're proposing is actually beneficial,
Sure.
not just simply their own experience, which I think is why we're having such an incredibly polarizing experience within our nation and political spectrum right now. We're in a far left-leaning swing of, you know, extreme woke in redefining what, you know, what it means to what is truth, and people in this current cultural conversation seem to be at some points a little offended by people trying to bring in truth that cannot move. It's not that these truths cannot move. It's just the people with the disposition towards protecting those truths have to do their part. If they don't, we go into complete chaos, potentially. Not necessarily, but potentially. And if the people who push this, like, let's dismantle the things that we find as true to see if they're of more worth, if they don't do their part, then we stagnate. So it's always going to be a back and forth. My worry is that we go too far back and forth, and we get way out of balance and eventually tip over.
Do you feel like we...
That's just the whole world in a nutshell there. So.
Sure, absolutely. Do you feel like, you know, we have a modern day kind of equivalent of sort of that John the Baptist, the prophets and the priests? And do you feel like one side is lacking in keeping the other out of balance or overcoming the other in some way?
Well, I think it's in our lack of valuing the other side where we go wrong.
Sure.
And so I'm of an extremely open disposition and find my value and purpose within creativity. But I was raised in an extremely conservative, conscientious, ordered culture. So everything that I experienced was based around this idea that everything is figured out.
Sure.
And all the truth is in our possession. And what you have to do then is memorize it and stay within the boundaries. And so for my experience as a kid growing up in a culture like that, not necessarily from my immediate family, my parents are pretty liberal, but the overarching kind of trajectory of the culture I was raised in was very certainty based in spiritual practice, religion, and that was the foundation of everything. So it was learn what we know, stay within the boundaries, memorize it, repeat it, on and on, which for someone who has a more creative disposition as it relates to the thing that it's outlining, spirituality, it felt stagnant and claustrophobic, mentally anxious for me to understand that my value of being creative is not something that is encouraged in this position,
Sure.
right? And so I had a long, 35 years of working my way out of that. But once I got out of that, I became so much more philosophically and theologically focused, because all of a sudden I had a problem to solve. I had lost this thing that helped me know everything that is, but it was too far right. It was too far right. And I think in a complete picture of reality, it's too far right. It's not a tension in the middle that embraces both a conscientious, hey, look, we really are getting the shade in there. It wasn't
Right,
something
Simon.
that enough met in the middle and allowed for those two dispositions to fully have purpose and to contribute.
Right. I'm going to go totally just off book here.
That's great. No,
But,
that's what this is for.
Yeah, I mean, you touch on a lot of the stuff I want to talk about, but sort of I
All
think
over the
that
place.
Sure,
That's a
yeah.
marker of a creative mind, is that like,
That's
and
it.
that's why it's so hard for me to write, is because as soon as I make a point, it connects to 10 other points at the same time.
Sure.
And I'm just like, which one do I pick?
This experience you sort of talked about with your childhood, I think sort of really extends beyond just sort of spirituality in the home life too. I think that, I was a terrible student.
You too, huh?
I think academically, we're also working with those same set of certainties. It's not the certainty of your soul, but it's, I feel like the educational system I came up with in the 90s, certainly didn't, and this will sound weird, but like reward making mistakes.
Mistakes are so important.
Right. I mean, I think that so much of the, you spoke about chaos. I mean, so much of the creative process is born from that. It's has to be embraced. And, certainly I'm not implying, schools should reward people for making mistakes, but it was just such a rigid experience where I found that,
but to some degree, I think that's appropriate. If you look at the creative practice of engineering, it doesn't sound creative in the title, and you don't think of engineers as being creative, but they attempt to do something and make a solution for a problem. And then they test it until it
fits in the boundaries and
fails.
They
test and test and test until they find the fail point.
Right.
And then they focus on the failure and they say, what failed there? Re-engineer that. And that is the whole creative process. It's just in a less expressive, it's in a less individually expressive manner, but it's still using the principles of creativity, of vastly changing your perspective and thinking outside the box to solve a problem.
Where does this creativity come from? How do you, I guess, cultivate? How's creativity cultivated? And, to me, it's something that doesn't come on its own. It's kind of like goes hand in hand with motivation. You're not going to wake up motivated. You sort of have to work it a little bit. And there's these sort of more romantic ideas about it, like a muse or,
Right.
Sometimes some people were, I have to paint, I have to create.
Right.
Or, it's almost like there's a neurological side to it. So
you're making all these bells and whistles go off, and I've
Sure.
already forgot the first bell that was like, oh, that's a great point.
Where's creativity cultivated?
So you're born with it.
Sure.
You're absolutely born with it. If you're born with it to a high degree, it's something that you have to do or you wither and die inside. You can also, and I love the idea of appropriation. Like we have this whole, again, cultural conversation around inappropriate appropriation. Inappropriate appropriation. That's an interesting one there. But like if you are white, you cannot play blues. Why is that? There's no law that says you can't. But you didn't go through the subjective experience that created the emotions and feelings that relate to the minor notes and contrast and changes in that music that could only have come out of that immediate subjective experience. You couldn't create it, and it seems slightly unauthentic, even if like a white person can do it well. It still comes across as a little like, you know, and I get that, but I don't think it's wrong. How I view that is that they created something that expressed so incredibly the scent through vibrations in the air. They created an art form that communicates suffering and oppression, which we all suffer and are oppressed in some way. I get that. Everyone has their different ways of suffering, but theirs was immense. And out of that came a whole genre and art form, essentially, in that. And you can learn the scales and everything else, but they did not come to you through experience, right? So in the same way, a person that's born open to experience as a psychological trait, okay? That's one of the big 5 personality things. You can have openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, assertiveness, and neuroticism. I'm pretty high in openness to experience, neuroticism, both of which are more feminine traits, which, sorry if that offends anyone. And then, and what are the other ones? My conscientious side is pretty low. And in that many ways is a balancing act between the two, but I was nurtured in a very conscientious environment. Mm-hmm. So I appropriated conscientious behavior unnaturally to myself. And when I do it, it looks like a white person trying to play the blues. It's not my natural state, and I didn't come to it through first-person experience of naturally I function better and I just exude organization. I understood what its function was, where it came from, and appropriated it into my behavior. So then it makes me, I actually blame that to a large degree for the success that I have been able to have, because I take a natural talent and then combine it with appropriating psychological behaviors and reward systems that are not natural to me. So when I interact with something novel, I receive dopamine in my head just from my brain, because I'm like, woo, this is new and different. When I experience something repetitive or something too many times, I start to lose the presence of emotion and all of my senses being aware in that moment that tell me more about what I'm experiencing. And this is a thing that they've outlined in psychological studies, where a person who's interacting with a repetitive experience will reference memory more than the information from their senses, which tells you you're not present in the moment in repetitive experience. And I have this really, it's so weird. I discovered that before I read about it, I think. I don't know if I read about it and then discovered it. It's hard to tell. But like I don't know if I'm including this in what I'm writing or not, but
sure.
My wife told me to not talk the whole time. I'm completely disobeying that.
That's fine.
So I have a master's in architecture. I'm an architectural photographer. I've experienced a lot of amazing spaces, and I've collected all of these ideas of what I want my house to be like. And about 4 years ago, we are actually able to materialize that. And the first time we walked into our home with being able to see out the design elements that we like really invested, floor to ceiling windows all the way around the living room. It's an amazing thing. And the first time you see it, you're fully emotionally just like, oh my goodness, this is, ah. And then the 1,000th time you see it, you're like, put the book bag down, do this, and you walk right through because you've mapped it. Mm-hmm. And in that experience, you can tell yourself and know this is beautiful and I appreciate it. But it does not sit with you like the first time you experience. You're not learning anything new in that experience. You're simply receiving the benefit of the consistency that allows you to outsource your brain towards doing other things. But in that moment of reliability, you can allocate energy towards other processing things, solving other problems, if you will. But in new experience, you can't put that attention elsewhere. You have to be fully present in all your senses. That's why things like travel, adventure, why you wouldn't take a vacation at home.
Right.
That's why a staycation does not feel like a vacation. You're not being fully present in that moment because you already know everything around you. But interestingly, we filmed the whole music video here in southern Maine around my property and Cape Porpoise and everything else. And it forced me to look at what I knew completely differently. And I have a much bigger appreciation of it now that I've kind of changed my perspective on it. And it's like I'm experiencing it all again for the first time. It's very weird. I have no idea what your question was and where I took it.
No, that's great. I mean, we talked about, where creativity comes from. And, I think you're right. Everyone is born with it.
But you can be creative, and everyone can create, just like everyone can sing. But some people get paid to do it because they're really good at it. Mm-hmm. Like yourself and like me, we're professional creatives. We've been able to train ourselves, discipline ourselves, and also develop our natural talent enough to where other people say, I will place a monetary value on you doing that again and again, which in itself, if you do it too much in too much of the same pattern, will become claustrophobic and uninspiring to you.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because so much of this is like questions I was going to ask down the line, but, we're here. It's, the monetizing that, there's sort of, when you're creative, you sort of have this fear of being boring. I think that, some of that is, you need to get rid of that fear because that's where you can sometimes be productive. Mm-hmm. I think it's a lot harder to create for yourself than it is to create for a client in some ways.
Yeah, I think you're right, because someone else can outline a problem for you. Mm-hmm. You have to be fully aware of every part of your map of reality to effectively say something singularly from your own experience. And it's much more dangerous to put something new out there only from yourself.
Right.
That's a good point. I never thought about that. How do you experience creativity? How do you look at it and interact with it?
Sure. So, kind of like I said, I mean, I think that you kind of spoke about this. You need to expose yourself to the world quite a bit.
In a good way, not
in a good way, not in a legal way. I think that every
just
time
being creative, officer.
That's right.
I listened to this podcast and it said, "Oh no."
Every time you have any sort of a major change in your life, if you get a new career or you build a house or you move, time really does start to slow down. Your first month in a new house really feels stretched out. All these brand new experiences.
When you're young, you don't have any articulate memory to compare your current experience against. So you're constantly emotionally fully present.
Right.
That's why childhood seems more magical.
Absolutely. So, and I think a part of it is forcing yourself to keep coming back to that place. Not that you have to move your house every year, but you need to constantly be seeking out new experiences. You need to, unplug a little bit.
See, now I wouldn't go so far as to say you need to, as much as I would say I need that. Mm-hmm. Because I know, like, my wife's extremely conscientious. She's very much, as far as I'm one way, she's the other way. But I'm constantly looking to take risk as a means of knowing more about myself. And that's very disconcerting and uncomfortable for someone who is not psychologically positive towards that type of experience.
Sure. Yeah. I think it's important to, having hobbies is the right kind of term, but you need to be able to foster your creativity, especially if it's your means of income, by sort of escaping from that world, going out. For me, if it's fishing, hiking, camping, whatever. Right. For you, maybe it's surfing. But I'll often find myself, if I feel a lack of creativity, whether mm-hmm. I'm at work, I'm doing layouts for a magazine or I'm designing a logo, and just need to completely, shut the computer down, pull out pencil and paper, and just sort of change the frame entirely. Right.
Change your reference point and tactile process, almost make it more physical in a way rather than a disconnected kind of button pushing process.
Absolutely. Another thing that you talked about that's kind of interesting in a different context is when we think of appropriation, so much I think of the process is also keeping in tune with what's happening in the creative world, both old and new. And
that's a hard one. It's kind of like style.
Sure. And it's, you sort of have to work at it. There's a lot of things I think as a creator, I'm going to keep going off.
No, that two people with no direction. We're just wandering. That's what creatives do, and that's why we need conservative people in our lives.
That's it.
Like
That's right.
everyone might be all like, the right's the worst thing ever. I am desperately liberal. I've always voted Democrat, but I'm coming to the point where I realize I don't want a overly liberal administration. I want some restraint of people saying, all right, these are all ideas, and we're gonna sift through the good ones to, and I don't want to make it like divisive, but you have to admit that there's a tension here that we need to embrace, not reject. And so if you can't openly talk about these things, you won't understand them. If you don't understand them, you'll proceed to just pull the thing further and further apart until it snaps. So if you're offended by that, fuck off.
Yeah.
So whatever.
Appropriation. Yeah. So there's a fine line, I think, with creatives between, being inspired and stealing. And sometimes, sometimes stealing is
okay.
I mean, I think of, there's like, I'll probably butcher it, but there's like David Bowie was asked, what music do you listen to? Whatever I can steal from is what I listen to,
Right. Right. I mean, that's what the early days of hip hop was. It like full on, like taking sections of music and recreating it to make a new thing.
Absolutely.
That was so cool.
For a new purpose. Yeah.
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 I mean, and it was a huge legal risk even at the time.
Sure.
If you there's some great documentaries on all of that are really interesting to see how the creative process in hip hop culture evolved and came about. But side note.
Yeah. So I guess, how does that play into your process at all, whether it's professionally or personally? And, I think there's several ways to look about it. One is nothing's original. So, closely follow the people that you look up to, the shoulders of giants,
Right.
Embrace that and work with it. Or do you constantly sort of try to always seek those totally new original ideas?
It's impossible to, in my opinion, to actually create anything completely new, because everything that's created comes from, at minimum, two other things that are now in relation, at minimum.
Sure.
So you think and I'm not saying you, but
Sure.
I'm saying they, whatever. You think you can create something out of absolute nothing? It is impossible. You will have to appropriate, at minimum, two existing things and now relate them in a new way to create something. It's short-sighted, ignorant, and just unwise to think that you cannot use something that exists. Now, to use something that exists humbly is the point, right? So I have this signature shot that my wife thinks is a signature shot. It's just like at the end of the bed, low, shooting towards the side table. It's not my signature shot in the least, in no way, shape, or form. But it was the first time she noticed it, so she assigned it to me.
Sure.
And, to me, that's ridiculous. And she always says it, and I'm just like, whatever, okay, fine. I'll take the compliment, sweetie, thank you, whatever. But I saw someone else do that. And I in no way, like, this is my signature shot. And I would never call Jeff Roberts and be like, hey, man, you're using my signature shot, man. What are you doing?
Right.
I'm not going to call another photographer and be like, you're ripping me off. What's going on? Like, we're all using cameras, shooting architecture or people or whatever. And how you mix and match that, I will openly and freely admit I was influenced primarily by Irvin Serrano, incredibly talented business mind, creative thinking, social connections, all of that. And I've always felt kind of bad because I learned so much from him, and he didn't really get to learn much from me because, for one, I was not in a place where I could really teach anything. I never went to photography school. I didn't know anything about it. And I had no business sense and very little social skills. And I learned so much from him, and I think he probably eventually felt like I was a leech, and wasn't giving back to that relationship at all. And I was, because of, I think, probably a lack of social awareness and being very self-centered to begin with, wasn't aware of that. And that's one thing where I could have been more humble and said more consistently in some way in that relationship, like, dude, thank you so much for all this stuff that you're sharing with me. It is so helpful, and I appreciate it so much. And in just going through that humbling, thankful exercise, I probably realized, I wonder if there's anything that I do that might be helpful to Irvin or something, right? And so if I see someone else replicating in the same way what I do, there is no patent on creativity or expression. Now, there is like exact copyright laws. Like, I can't take a picture of Irvin's or Jeff's or anyone else and use it as my picture, but I can absolutely be inspired by it and appropriate some of their approach into my approach. Now, if I am simply just copying all the time as a means of making an income and a name for myself, that'll over time become evident, and I'll fall out of vogue or whatever, So I think it's primarily being putting your ego away and on both sides of that conversation, and having a very humble approach and acknowledging all of the influences that you do have, to give credit to the people that inspire you and help you. So I guess I have not a different take than you, but I would not side with people that feel that appropriation in that sense is a negative thing. So
certainly. Yeah. I mean, I constantly have to, look at the work of those that inspire me.
Right.
And, not to one for one rip it off, but, often, to deconstruct it,
totally
reconstruct it, and sort of see what I can learn in the process. And,
you're taking something established, pulling it apart a bit, and kind of reassemble it in this way, or pulling it apart, understanding how it was assembled, saying, oh, I could apply that to this assembly and learn from it and grow and elevate the entire existence of everything.
Right.
That, and which in what way is appropriation bad? Is that an effective or good question to consider? Like, appropriation without acknowledgement of where the influence came from seems like a bad idea. To me, if and it's also, I kind of believe why you shouldn't switch religions, which is a crazy thing to say, but it feels like disingenuous because you've got all the baggage and crap from whatever you were raised in that also tells you about the real deep and subtle things of that culture that point towards the good things of the culture, and to simply throw all that away and just kind of like, I'm going to be a Buddhist. Like, you didn't have to have the annoying Buddhist mom and go to Buddhist temple and like, you have to have all that bad and good in that experience to truly have the experience and to truly be that. You can appropriate it and you can practice that religion, but you're not going to have the same thing as someone who was born in it, which, again, I don't think it's wrong. I think it's just a harder and more responsible road to plow, I guess, to stay somewhere that is unpleasant, but work towards reforming it. That's like the hard call. Mm-hmm. Like, and I don't want to stay within Adventism and have not, and don't feel that it is a good place for me to be. I don't know that I'd completely disengage with trying to understand spirituality through a Christian point of view, but most any Christian would probably call me a pretty bad apostate at this point. So whatever.
Well, the interesting flip side of that is, especially with Christianity, most want you to appropriate the religion.
Yes,
and I think you convert.
Well, yeah, That's another kind of odd thing. But I think there's a strong correlation at getting at the exact same thing between the creative cycle and religion. They're both trying to determine kind of, in a way, origin, direction, destination, and ending, right? The creative cycle we're born into, we just become aware within this cycle. It's not like we're introduced outside of the cycle. You're born in that cycle, and you feel your way into your position being either primarily conscientious or open through dopamine reward cycles, and then you embrace that experience openness, or you embrace that conscientious honor, integrity, and consistency. And, I mean, you have all these stereotypes of, like, police officers are usually far more conscientious. I mean, you don't want an expressive, wandering, pondering police officer. Like, car 5, where are you? Someone's being murdered. And it's like, oh, I was just down at the beach watching the birds, Like, I get it, And at the same time, someone who's incredibly rigid and unwilling to experience, attempting to be an artist, is not going to have anything new to say. They'll be able to really, hammer down and clearly outline what exists already, but they're not going to be making any revelations as much. So it's such a weird, entangled thing that is at every part of our existence. That if I could just figure out how to write,
right?
Maybe I can start a cult.
All right, what else we got here? Let's see.
Here's an interesting thing to tell you about that I was going to with my living room, and this idea of when you're in repetitive experience, you reference more memory than information from your senses. And this is why I've never been able to hold down a normal job and was always a bad employee. So the 1,000th time I come into my living room, it does not have the same effect on me. The first time, it's like, wow, this is amazing. And in one draft of this article I'm trying to write, this is completely in, and then the other draft I have is far more academic and not story-based at all, which is probably very uninteresting and would go right over people's heads. So who knows what ends up happening. But anyways, the 1,000th time you enter the living room, it doesn't have the same effect on you. But the nice thing, and I think this is why I did it, the nice thing about having floor-to-ceiling glass looking out to the forest is that it's constantly changing. It's never the same. So you integrate this organic, constantly changing thing into your experience within the house. And we were lucky enough to get an incredibly ridiculous deal on land, and all we see is forest around our house. Wow. Like some grove and forest. And that's super nice. Every time you come in, there is that thing that is different each time, which is really inspiring. But it loses its effect on you. So I think it was last year around October, I was standing in the kitchen, just kind of picking my nose and looking towards the windows towards the north. And the light was coming in low in October like it does. And it was very beautiful. But, it was like I'd seen that before. I was like, all right, I'll turn around and get a snack out of our glossy cabinets. We have glossy white cabinets from IKEA. And I turn around and I go to reach for the cabinet. And do you know what happened? Where's the aha moment here? So I'm always wondering if people like know where you're going with something.
Sure, no.
So a big epiphany hit me at that point, right? I'm looking at the handle to pull it, and they're vertical handles, so it's mostly all just a big white glossy flat thing. In the cabinet, I see my living room mirrored. And all of a sudden, I'm looking at it and I'm like, whoa, that is really beautiful. Like all of a sudden, emotion flooded me like it hadn't since I saw the place for the first time. It's like, there it is. And so I turned around to take it all in, first person right there. Nothing.
Yeah.
Nothing. I turn back around to the cabinet. I look at it again, and I notice like the angle changes of the forest and the rocks and the wind. And it's all there emotionally filling in all my senses because it's mirrored. It's different. And I couldn't understand in that moment, like, what is going on? Why am I experiencing emotion looking at that? But when I look at the real thing, I don't feel anything, but I did when I first looked at it. And it wasn't until I heard an interview probably a month ago that they mentioned this, that in a repetitive experience, you reference memory more than all of your senses being present in that moment. And that's why people who are open to experience are seeking that constant, I need to have a new experience where I can be in the fullness of my senses to learn more, to fill in my map of reality so I can connect problem to solution. So I can connect, reality to meaning. So I can determine and more productively fulfill my value and purpose of being creative. Because having that wide picture that connects everything through your personal experience allows you to start at a point and have the understanding and the wisdom through the first person experience. Not that you've been told or read wisdom as much as you've actually experienced. It allows you to connect those things all the way from there to here more easily than someone who's more compartmentalized, who can focus on concrete things for more periods of time, for longer extent. And another interesting thing that I've found in my own experience, and I don't know if this is common with all creatives, but if there's a problem with me, and you might be able to say something about this, if there's a problem with me personally, my map of reality and my ability to be creative crumbles immediately.
Oh, certainly.
Now, why is that? Why can't we compartmentalize this problem, put it over there, and just keep doing our little creative? Why on earth does that happen? But if someone comes to us with a problem that's theirs, we can use our map to help them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the value that we as creatives play to society. But it's also why creatives tend to be more potentially depressed, melancholy, introspective, loners, all of that. The creative is pitted in a position of high risk, high reward within society. Conservative disposition, someone who's more highly conservative, finds their natural disposition works within the establishment like a beautifully designed gear. The creative their value is dismantling the entire system to a degree, figuring out how to improve it.
Mm-hmm.
Which, if you come into a group or a group or a system, anything that has found what they think to be clear answers that they can associate around. So a religion, a business, a school, anything. They believe they have clear answers and they associate as a group because of that. If you come in as a creative, you have no purpose there if the answers are too clear.
Sure.
So what do? You start to turn over all of their, clear answers that they have that are keeping them adhered as a group. That doesn't make them comfortable.
Right.
It's unsettling. That's why I never felt quite useful or firing on all cylinders within a conservative religion. It's just keep memorizing and shut up, And I'm but that's not my value.
Right.
And so there's this whole cycle of this, it affects everything, just absolutely everything. And it's encompassed or encapsulated in the yin and the yang. It's it's beautiful. And I just heard this on another podcast that idea of these opposing forces that work together, but that also have a bit of themselves in the other, like the little dot in the water drop.
Maintaining harmony.
Yeah. That idea of maintaining harmony is this interaction of what I, at the most fundamental level, would understand as truth and love. Truth being the more masculine aspect, love being the more relational, feminine aspect. I orient far more feminine than I do masculine in that way. And the experience and the relating to ideas, concepts, being creative is the direction where I feel that value. And I've been able to appropriate that other balancing aspect to create a cohesive working organism, at least able to supply income for his family. So,
yeah, I mean, I think it's so. I think I keep thinking about your story here of the reflection in the cabinet. I think that it's the so necessary for creatives, or
Explain
really everybody.
sonus to me. I'm not great with words.
What's that?
Sonus?
So necessary.
Oh,
Sorry.
okay. I
think
like,
it's so
sonus,
necessary.
That's a new word.
To kind of find that. I think that everybody innately is always sort of looking for that reflection in the cabinet moment. And sort of, you talked about the way that your mind works as a child because you don't have that relative sense of the rest of your life yet. And C.S. Lewis, the writer, sort of kind of talked about he got into fantasy writing because it was a way that would transport you sort of back to that space. And it
unlooses all the established things to try and study them more.
He actually took it a step further and said, a man innately has this desire to get back to this state before like the original sin. And, through these, and that sort of addresses that. But,
interestingly, the idea of original sin and Garden of Eden and everything else in the very classical Christian origin story, it's the feminine side that wandered and caused conflict, right? And that's an embodiment of me. Like there's nothing more I like to do than to just simply wander and like, oh, it looks nice. What's this?
Sure.
Well, there you go. Like it's embodied in that story that this thing, I don't know that they were necessarily in that story pointing out how dangerous it is to be creative. Like I don't think that's what they're saying, but there's some deeper idea there that when separated from your balancing force, you can go too far. That's the moral of that story to me, that Eve was not with Adam and then she wandered too far because of that. Like, is that essentially what we're doing right now as a nation? Are we separated from each other? And in a sense, both sides are now wandering too far. I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. I think there's a lot of truth in that. Is it factually true? That's a different discussion that
sure
I have.
That goes right back to the yin and yang,
right.
Or we rather than living in harmony choose to say, all right, if we're going to spend 4 years as a yang society and 4 years as a yin society, and sort of
maybe it'll be 8, we can really go far this way. Like, oh gosh, can we just hire an independent for once, please? Yeah. I did everything I could to get Marty Gorman elected as an independent at the state level. But people are just they want that comfort of the identification with their team rather than someone who pulls them closer to the middle. It's such a hard battle to win.
Really, it is.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But
what else do I have here? Creativity. We kind of have talked about this enough. I have a question that Danielle gave me. What does it feel like to be creative?
Yeah, that's okay.
We touched on it a little bit, but yeah.
What's it feel like for you?
I think that to me it feels like almost essential. So not to be like going back to like the I have to paint, but I think that getting that dopamine and serotonin and all that other stuff going, that to me is my outlet. And when I go too long without exercising those muscles, or without having that reflection in the cabinet moment, is when you do start to have these things that you said creatives are prone to this, and you see it all the time. It's Van Gogh, Poe, whatever.
Right.
To me, it feels like just exercising those muscles and out of a necessity, that I need to live. Because there's a reward to it that you sort of thrive on.
Mm-hmm. So I'm holding 3 fingers up because I'm trying to remember a point, but I don't want to get to it yet, and I'll lose it so quick. But as a creative, you will either be on a spike, on shoulders, or dead inside. So bring me back to that.
Sure.
In thinking about creativity, my experience has told me that it is so incredibly important to understand that this is not a solo performance. You have to have the balancing side. You cannot simply be creative without cutting it with truth. It has to be there. If there's no truth within the creativity, it's not going to ring true. and it's not going to be something that you've found that will be reliable in any way, shape, or form, or even connect with the truth of an experience. Like you might, as an artist, be able to create something that's cathartic for you, but other people won't see it as much because it won't touch on a truth that connects us.
Mm-hmm.
So that has to be there. In writing about creativity, the first thing I wanted to say was that it's not a creative process. It's a process of balance that creativity is in. So the whole creative process, for lack of a better word, is a creative process that has both half conscientious nature to it and creative nature to it. Unfortunately, we call the whole thing, we identify it as like creativity when it's a combination that is never a solo effort, in my opinion. So coming to that, what does it feel like to play that part in creativity? You have three options as a creative. You'll either be put on a spike, you'll either be lifted on shoulders, or you will die inside. Now, a conscientious person, when faced with their calling, the things that they receive dopamine for, that is to maintain, protect, and convey or teach what is established. So it comes with a manual. You know what you have to do, and you can do it. It's a much less complex existence. Complex is a word that you hear constantly describing creatives. So the complexity with creatives is embodied in this idea that you only get to be on a spike on shoulders or dead inside. And that's because if in relation to the whole of society, we'll represent it with this table from IKEA. If you are coming at it saying, all right, we need to figure out what we can improve by looking under things, moving things around, and in messing with that to try and rearrange it to create something new. If you mess up and you fail, you've gone outside the boundary and you've messed up, and you come back and they're like, you messed up. We told you so. You're on a spike. We're going to put you at the gate and everyone's going to know, don't mess up. We set these boundaries to protect us. You're bad. We don't want other people to do this. You're on the spike.
Certainly.
Okay. Option 2, you leave the boundaries. You go outside the medieval wall that protects us all that we're building to find more bricks, and you make an incredible discovery of baking like reeds into your clay bricks, and all of a sudden they're amazing, whatever. You come back from going outside the boundaries and you come back with something new that just is illuminating, and everyone says, we cannot deny you have gone outside our boundaries. You have found something of worth and you've brought it back to us. Get on our shoulders. We're having a parade. That's the second option. And that's where you and I find ourselves right now. We're being paid for creating things. And, it's not necessarily that we're doing something that puts everyone at risk and we're going to be put
Sure.
on, but you get the analogy, right?
Sure.
If you mess up horribly, you're going to get fired. Not because you broke any ethical thing or anything else, but just because the subjective experience of maybe looking at the magazine isn't pleasant, you'll be fired.
Mm-hmm.
Like and you have to create that aesthetic niceness out of your experience personally. You're so personally involved in it. It's spike or shoulders. Now, if you don't have enough courage to put yourself out there, to be creative, to either risk the spike or gain the shoulders, right? Then you're not answering your calling, and you will just simply wither inside. And that is the stress in a conscientious person's life is the creatives. And I just asked my wife. That's
sure.
And I said that exact thing to her this morning. She's like, you don't think I live with stress? I have to live with you. And I'm like, I know that's your calling, is to keep people like me in check. Like, you're the judge. You're the person I've got to get this stuff passed. I know if I can come up with an idea that my wife can't argue against, that I've actually done something, because she's incredibly intelligent. She has an incredibly sharp memory, way more than me. And she has a concept of everything that is. She loves learning. She loves school, but she does not like risk, right? So she's a great judge. She's oriented towards protecting what is. by knowing what is and defending it and how it works from crap that I might come up with. But occasionally I can come up with something real good. And they're thinking, all right, okay, I'm gonna bring it in. Good for you, you know. So what's that feel like? I wake up just mentally grinding on concepts constantly. It's a constant, the inside of my head feels like being in Times Square, and your consciousness is plastered against those jumbotrons that are splashing everything around all the time. That's my existence of, I am aware of and experience everything all at once constantly. And I'm not very organized in storing those memories, but perceiving them. And then they kind of go into filling in my map that I see all the time, everything through, and then use that to create things. But there's that calling to constantly be working on ideas or experiencing new. So if I'm not working or experiencing, I'm kind of either positively taking some time to just regenerate, or I'm feeling very stagnant. So that's what it feels like. It's not, I think creative people on an average will be markedly less happy or rate their happiness as high as a conscientious person would. But that's a guess. I don't know. I know that critical people are usually more in touch with reality, but less happy.
Sure.
Which is kind of a insult to both sides at the same time.
Yeah. My next question was, what are the risks of being creative? Which I think you did a nice job of touching
Spikes.
on there. Yeah, exactly.
Head on a spike at the gates.
and you know, I think that in practice, some of those things in reality overlap a little bit, right?
Oh, yeah.
So if I'm constantly being lifted up on shoulders, maybe I'm dying a little inside.
Well,
as a result.
I would imagine maybe that. See, I've always struggled with the weirdness of old rock stars. They're not making new stuff that anyone appreciates.
Right.
Why is that? There's something. The rock star is a personification of the prophet archetype. Their natural disposition intersects with the cultural conversation at the time and elevates them. It's not that they could have done this at any time in history, I don't think, as much as their specific view aligned with the cultural conversation at the time.
Right.
In their creative way. If you take people like Kurt Cobain or Vedder, or, you know, it's just this, you know, it was big metal hair, and then it came to this idea of, you know, less is more instead of all of this glam rock stuff. And that disposition, that voice at that time was what we as a culture needed, especially in our youth. But it's that time of angst that you naturally struggle with establishing yourself in. That's that moment of your life when you're trying to figure out who you are and what you're going to be. And so you have a lot of angst, questioning, and everything else. So it's a more clear personification of the struggle at the time. If you're struggling when you're in your 40s or 50s, it's not going to be lauded as if you're struggling with angst at that age specifically, that's what's going to be at a loss. Now, if you're a 40-year-old country musician, that's a different story, right? Even maybe a pop musician to a degree, but like rock embodies angst or like if you were to go with a more like a aggressive gangster rap or anything else, like an old guy doing gangster rap, you know, you've outlived your voice, you know? And so to go and watch these rock stars, you're watching at that point the repetition of something rather than the emotional presence of it. That's what it is. I just figured that out. Nice.
Certainly, yeah. Yeah, I mean,
that's weird.
That's a great analogy. You know, I also think of, you know, so many, you know, specific to music. You know, you have people like Bob Dylan that are important for
but he wasn't angst.
Too.
He was insight.
Certainly, I mean, he's you know, definitely fits the prophet archetype,
right? And I'm sure he had some angst, but the majority of his thing was insight that went far beyond youth, and And that's why you call some people of a younger age an old soul.
Right.
Like they've gotten past the angst somehow, and they're wise and introspective beyond their years. And that, yeah, someone like Bob Dylan, I mean, Bobby McFerrin or whatever, it's not an expression of confusion and angst, and it's insight. Yeah. And there's a longevity to that is different than that weirdness of punk rock or angst or whatever. So
sure. Yeah. I think that, he still suffers from the same, like, nobody's listening to the really new Bob Dylan music, right?
Yeah, I mean, he's got some great stuff though, even recently.
Sure.
Spirit on the Water. That was some good stuff. But
I think that, a part of it though is that in the moment felt so important to so many people.
Yeah,
too.
I mean, he was that guy at that time that had that voice that was the voice of that generation, in a way. And even now, listening to his music, like even his lesser hits, it's like there's something in there that, like, on the surface, if you don't know anything about Dylan and you hear Dylan, it's like, that guy's got no talent. Who would ever, why, like, but when you get into it, you're like, whoa, there's something here. And
it's almost intangible at first.
Of course. Yeah, no, it is. But luckily someone caught that and like uploaded him into, and I wonder if there was no other option than for him to be that, but who knows?
It's also the music and creativity. And I guess it's the same with the visual arts. It's so, our experience as a culture with how we find creatives and see work is so much different now. In Bob Dylan's day, a handful of people got discovered and uploaded to society.
Right.
Now we have this immense saturation of, YouTube and Instagram and everything, and
Right.
another, just to branch off again, I started, when I went to art school, I thought I was going to be a photographer. And
when I went to architecture school, I thought I was going to be an architect.
Yeah, so learning sort of these darkroom techniques and cross-processing color film and getting really good at it and feeling really good was, this was the early 2000s. It just really coincided right with when digital photography got good, because it was
Right.
like sort of like, oh, okay, no, these look bad. Sort of like, okay, this is fine. But then also, as I'm like getting closer to graduation, was right when this got really good at taking a photo. And I remember talking to a professor and saying, I'm kind of like salty and angry about this. I've worked so hard at this and,
Right.
Got so good at taking photographs. Now everyone can do it. And, he said, well, this is like, that should be celebrated.
Right.
There's now so much more photography in the world, which is a good thing. And we should, rejoice at the, this accessibility.
Yeah, there's the cultural gain was the accurate witness, right? The higher degree of accurate witnessing of things. So Black Lives Matter, if we didn't have cell phones at this point, Black Lives wouldn't matter. And that is an inflammatory, sarcastic statement.
Certainly, but I know what you mean.
It's because everyone's got a high quality camera on them that, I mean, do you remember towards the beginning of the internet when you'd interact with someone that you hadn't seen in maybe like a month, you'd start going over all the crazy things that you had seen that you never saw before. It was like an amassing of a Faces of Death video, but of just like amazing, like this chipmunk swam across a river or whatever.
Sure.
Like you didn't see those things. And all of a sudden we were seeing them consistently.
Right.
Because everyone had it. And you'd get together and you'd share those things. But then they became so dispensed among the masses that it's just a commonality that you just go to Reels on Instagram now and every single thing you see is the most amazing thing ever. And you see it for 4 seconds. You're like, well, I guess I'll see another amazing thing. And then you're on the toilet for 45 minutes and you can't feel your legs.
Just getting that dopamine and serotonin constantly.
And it's got to be doing something weird to our trajectory, because creativity comes from this full experience, not just the peak. It's like what we're doing instead of going on hikes is we're just being airlifted between peaks.
Right.
And it's like, where's the experience? Where's that, like on a long hike towards the end of it, you're hurting and you're hungry and you're thirsty, but man, you understand what you did and how you did it. And you look forward to like that meal at whatever all you can eat place maybe at the end of that, right?
Yeah.
I remember going through that, and now in this kind of experience, I'm addicted to it and I hate it. And I just like, there's so many incredible things, but there's something missing that feels like brain, like an acid in a bad way. That's just kind of like, I'm filling it up, but not with anything of any value.
We're only ever getting the punchline.
Yeah. It's just a constant punchline or whatever else.
How do you bring creativity to architectural photography? So
in many ways, it's a restriction of creativity.
Right.
Which is odd. So let me explain.
Sure.
If I get too creative and someone looks at the photograph and says, wow, what an amazing photograph, I've not done my job properly. Because in that moment, the person's looking at a photograph rather than architecture. But if I make a great photograph and the response is what an amazing piece of architecture, then I've done my job properly. So if I want to go in and play all these tricks and bells and whistles of like, I put a light over here and a light over here and I made it, it's just a busy mess of someone trying to be overly creative on top of someone else's creativity. I'm highlighting someone else's creativity in the act of architectural photography, and I understand that. And I very much limit the out of the box stuff in that. I try and keep it as natural, clean, refined, and simple in every composition that I can. I take everything out of the image until it feels empty and then start to add back in. It's a constant editing process for me. In that, I think translates into whatever look I have. Sometimes, yeah, but it for me there's definitely the creativity comes in first where the composition says the right thing and allows the viewer to place themselves in the image. Like I have to basically take anything that I'm looking at shooting and I simply walk a circle around it. And at some point it feels like the key turned. And when I feel that, I'm like, this is probably it in here. And then we'll start to go up and down focal lengths from there. And then you start to look at things intersecting wrong or apexes coming into things where it shouldn't. And that is more of the creative process. And then understanding what the light is going to say about the created space and where the person would place themselves in that image. There's all of those kind of things where the creativity and the problem solving happens. But I'm not functioning as an artist in that moment at all, right. In my opinion. I'm functioning as a creative problem solver looking to communicate what someone else has been creative on. So that's how creativity comes through me in a professional environment.
I can definitely relate to that. To me, so much of creativity is subtraction.
Right.
And it's like you said, you have to take at least two existing things. And that's such a big part of my, design theory in general. And one of the conscious decisions I made when I came to the magazine was, if I looked at other similar magazines, a big thing I thought was there's too much everywhere, like things need more room to breathe. And,
Have you ever looked at Detail magazine? Not the American kind of smutty one, but the German architectural Detail magazine?
I'm not in person. I've seen it.
So good.
I've been to their website. Yeah, I'll have to get my hands on
it. They'll just do like a full page photo and then just like a single column of text and just a bunch of negative space, which I know costs a lot of money, but
that is the hard part.
So good, right? Yeah, you got to pay the bills. So it's like this balance. Like there's truth to it that you're not going to stay open unless truly you make some money,
right?
And finding the most complex and highly tuned way of doing that is where the best representation of the magazine will be. But it will also be when it gets to that point, it naturally gets to a potentially high fail rate.
Sure.
Because it's so intricate and engineered to just barely, it's a weird problem.
It is a weird problem. And the what keeps me feeling confident is that kind of just what we talked about is this. I think that sitting on the toilet for 45 minutes scrolling through eventually does sort of start to devastate you, and you do have this burnout. And I think that print media is one of those things that
it's a slower medium, that it's more tactile experience, slower.
Tactile too. I mean, I think of the MP3 revolution and the iPods, and
Right.
then almost like really shortly after, I'd say that was like 2000 when that happened, and then I think by like mid to late 2000s you had this huge resurgence in vinyl records.
Right.
Everyone
Right.
wants to hold the object and be with their friends and go over and spin the thing over, and
Right.
because I think we do lose something and get a little bit burned out, and that's what keeps me hopeful about print. Maybe it's naive optimism, but
So how does it feel for you making a living with creativity or through creativity? And especially that you're on a grind. You're not someone who can work twice a week and recuperate the rest. It's an everyday thing
right.
for you.
Yeah, you're always racing the clock. I mean, the biggest thing I feel is just really lucky, honestly. I mean, and I've always sort of thought that.
There's an odd feeling of luck with anyone who's creative, who's able to make a living through their creativity, which also puts you at a point of being highly able to be victimized in relation to that, which in the previous iteration of Maine Home+Design was a concern.
You should be thankful for the exposure you get by being able to work with us.
I mean, New York Times called up and I was like, oh, Times, I can't believe it. I'm going to $200. I was like, wait, what? I can't pay my assistant with that. What are you kidding?
Right.
And, eventually I worked it out with them. But yeah, it seems so predatory to me that with that instance. And yeah, why is it that we're treated that way? I think there's an intrinsic relationship to those that are driving the business, probably have more of a conscientious view of things, the establishing order and systems to maintain a thing. And those that are contributors in a creative sense are less organized, typically less assertive, less organized, less assertive, like these type of things that would make them more easily able to be taken advantage of.
Certainly.
And so that's always been a hard thing. And that's something that I've appreciated with the new ownership with Maine Home+Design, is that they've been more proactive in establishing normalcy and respect and with contributors and everything else, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, no, it's been wonderful. I think a big part of the work that you put into being a creative, from a corporate viewpoint or to the rest of the world, does go underappreciated, because on the surface, if I want to hire Trent to go shoot, I'm thinking, how long is he going to be at the house? He's going to have to go there for 6 hours, and then what? He's got maybe 4 hours of editing. What does that quantify? And when the truth is, the unique thing about being a creative is, that didn't take you 12 hours to do the project. That took you 20 years.
It took all that wandering into experience to help me make a map that I could then use the map to create or, connect problem A with solution B. And if you don't have that, you can't do it.
Right.
And that in a systematized, monetized system, it's a hard thing to recognize that investment of personal experience into the ability to be creative. So then you're faced with the problem of, how do I monetize this? And I'm like you. My first thought is like, I'm just lucky. I'm just lucky.
We've been trained to kind of think that way.
Yeah,
certainly.
And I am, but at the same time, I instinctually married my opposite, who brought into my existence a real consistency and boundaries and a lot of financial sense and everything else that helped us plan, organize, and protect ourselves against me feeling like I can feel overwhelmed by pretty much anything if I'm not careful. And she somehow recognized that and structured our lives to allow my ability to be creative, to have more room, and to not have the pressures as much of financial gain constantly around it. There's a deep wisdom in her orienting us and setting us up in that way that I hated.
Sure.
I felt like, things were being nailed to the floor that shouldn't be. And it was just the worst thing ever. But it's not until you experience the results over time that you get the wisdom through the experience to then know, all right, okay, all right, I get it. That was good. And I have all of this and all of this fulfillment now, not simply because, but empowered by this decision and these processes that you gave to us. And I mean, she completely supported us for probably 5 to 7 years while I was out constantly trying to figure out how to monetize creativity.
Sure.
Which is good luck. I look back on it now and I only feel fear. Like, if I had to start over, I couldn't do it because it seems like such a tiny window to make a shot for. I wouldn't have the energy, all of that it took to do that. But I also know that I've become accustomed to this rhythm now, and I could do it from memory. So maybe I could, but there's still that feeling of lucky, which makes you think that you weren't worth it. You were just lucky.
Yeah, valuing yourself and your work has always been a big challenge to me. I remember my senior thesis show, putting out, I did a show, it was printmaking and photography, a kind of a combination, and putting price tags on these prints. And one of my mentors and professors being like, I was like 20, and he was like, no, 100. And I was like, that's crazy. And he's like, no, it's not, like, that's normal. And just thinking like, whoa, but I'm like, these are prints, they took me 5 minutes to make. And he's like, no, this is normal. And just trying to,
you're not getting it here, man.
Understand that. And that, I think that that sense of feeling lucky, a lot of it goes hand in hand with imposter syndrome too, right?
Oh, yeah.
Like, and I often will feel like that, like, any minute now they're going to figure me out.
Until you take the time to actually describe every step and thought process of what you do.
Right.
I've felt the same thing. I'm like, dude, I'm just setting up a camera.
I'm going to get found out.
Like, taking a pretty picture of like an amazing thing that you guys did. And like, someone's going to figure out that anyone can do this. And then I have someone with me sometimes who I have to explain what I'm doing, or someone who's just asking questions. And I can talk forever on simple, minor decisions that influence the whole. And I realize at that moment that, like, there's far more going on here than you're fully conscious of in the moment. There's an experiential, subjective wisdom and knowledge of experience guiding your every decision that's only there because you experienced as much as you possibly could to inform you in those moments.
Right.
Which, puts you at constant danger.
So other than Irvin Serrano, who, if he was here, I'm sure would say wonderful things about you. And I was thinking about that.
I don't know that he would.
Maybe
we didn't. I mean, and I think that's fair.
Sure.
I can be quite a not pleasant person to be around at times, and I've worked for the last decade to try and not be that type of person. And I just feel bad that I know he was a friend, and I also know that he did not get as much probably out of our relating to each other as I did. And I feel bad about that. But
have you mentored someone? Have you been a teacher in photography?
The mentor relationship, I don't get that. But again, I have a lot of peculiarities that I am only slowly becoming aware of. I feel that in the process of shooting architecture, it would be so incredibly difficult to constantly explain what I'm doing.
Sure.
That I've had a lot of people approach me like, hey, can I come on a shoot with you? And I'm just like, I'm so out of it as far as what else is going on when I'm so highly focused on this moment. Because the interesting thing, like, in that moment, there's usually a family that's unable to be in their home. Like if we're shooting a residence, right? There's a family unable to be in their home. There's an architect not able to bill hourly, sometimes 2 or 3.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's usually interns as well that they're not able to bill, or lower level employees, not owners of the firm, that also aren't able to bill. And there's usually a stylist that's brought a bunch of equipment there today, or styling there the day of. There's all these things happening in that single moment. And it is very much a dance right now, monkey boy, and entertain us.
Yeah.
And if you don't, you may never be able to do this again.
Right.
And you will have to go and get a normal job and die slowly inside. So there's that constant ripping at you in that moment. And for me to like bring a pet to work kind of thing, or bring a kid to work, even in just being able to sit there, my poor boy, it's just like, I'm getting bored.
Of course.
But I've never mentored in that way. I've had a lot of friends that have helped me, which is mentoring. And I try, and through the YouTube videos and stuff that we put out, I try and take questions that people have around architecture, photography, and respond to them in that way, mentoring, but not directly. It's always such a busy and last minute thing, being somewhere at like 8 a.m. in Boston means you're getting up here like around 4:30 or 5. Right. It's just such a weird thing. But if I think of like influences, I mean, it's Irvin Saron. I mean, geez, like my wife has influenced me so much in just my approach and realizing the value of what is not natural to me and how valuable that thing is. Everything that I learned from Irvin, from sharing a studio with him for a few years. My friend Chet Williams is a commercial photographer out in California. And his ability to, like, I don't go and do any kind of creativity usually until recently with a camera unless I'm working. Like, there's something within me that tells me, don't go out and make a bunch of work for yourself that you're just going to have to spend more time on later. Take this time to recuperate and use the time when you're getting paid to do the creative stuff.
Right.
More recently, I've had a more artistic interaction with photography and doing a lot of abstract stuff, which is odd, but it's the first time I felt like I had something I was trying to grasp at and say through in a creative expression. So I would call that artistic. But my friend Chet, he's always out shooting no matter what. He's just kind of one of those people who's always kind of able to make anything look amazing, like just a surfboard fin or sand or lead, you name it. He's like, sure. Oh, that's really cool. He's constantly seeing things differently. And then, I mean, like big names, Eric Almus and people like that have been inspirations. It's funny. Like you said something earlier about kind of valuing what you do, trying to figure out how to value it. And I had no clue what to charge as an architectural photographer in this region when I started out. But at the time, I was coming out of being an architect and had, through the business that Caleb and I started, had purchased 2 or 3 rental properties, multi-units, because they would give money to anyone that had a pulse in the early 2000s.
Sure.
So we had a couple of buildings, and I called up who was it? It wasn't Solomon Setlow. I think it was Darren
Sure.
Setlow. And because he was the first person that came up in my search, and I was no one at the time at all. And I was like, architectural photographer, Southern Maine. I saw Darren Setlow. I think it was him. I called him and I was like, hey, I've got a couple properties. I'm wondering what it would cost for just a day to come and shoot them. And he started asking all these specific questions. Like, I'm just trying to get a general idea of what a day would cost. And I was being honest.
Yeah.
But it was definitely not me calling up and saying, hey, I would like to do what you do, and you do it pretty well.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering what you charge so I can just aim at something.
Yeah.
So I kind of around the way, called him up, and he was like, well, it's about this much. And I was like, all right, cool. Well, thanks. I remember actually buying books and actually reading books around business practice and how to use. When I first got professional gear, I had no idea how to actually put a lens on a camera. And within, I think, a month, I had the cover of Maine Home+Design back then. And it wasn't because I just had some hyper talent. I had developed habits that were very conscientious, driven, assertive, organized talents, or behavioral practices, appropriated behavioral practices, and combine that with natural ability of, I just had a high fascination with technical things. I had never had an interest in photography because of the darkroom aspect. To me, that was too much creative turnaround, and I didn't like being in a tight, dark, enclosed space, and I didn't like working with chemicals. So that side of photography I just wasn't interested in and never did it. But when it became digital in the 2000s, it was like, ooh, I have played around with cameras, and I did have a smaller digital camera that my wife actually bought for me at the time. And through that, started taking pictures for fundraising stuff for the architecture school I was at. And I remember specifically thinking to myself at the time, man, if I could make a living at doing this is really incredible. I really enjoy this.
Sure.
And then even then, a decade later then, I remember reading an article about a guy that was a surfer who was also a photographer that lived on the southern coast of Massachusetts. And it was an article in Surfer's Journal called My East Coast Ranch. And he had a boat, and he would go out to little islands where there was surf. And he had a little bit more of a flexibility in his schedule because he was a photographer. And I was like, again, man, that would be great to be able to make a living like that, but I could never do that. And it wasn't until I just got so dead inside with the repetition of everything that's required in being an architect that is outside of my normal personality trait. The risk involved in being an architect is so huge. I mean, you design the steps wrong by an inch and it's a $50,000 mistake.
Right.
All of that stuff, safety and everything else, and drawings over time lining up consistently, with the lines below, and all of that was just so much to me that eventually I just burnt out and had to find a different way, and kind of wandered in. My friend Chet had told me, well, you've got this background in there, why don't you do this, combine it with that? And so I went out and bought a camera and combined it with all my other experience and said, I'm going to do this. I'm going to figure it out. I'm at that point, probably in my late 20s, realizing that I needed to figure something out. And that I felt like at the time I was throwing away the last 7 to 8 years of my life.
Right. Because
I had all this education and experience, and I'm just throwing it out the window. And at that point, I was just going to continue to buy, renovate, and sell properties. But then my friend was like, you should give a go at photography. And I saw what he was making. I compared it to what Darren was making. It all seemed to line up and make sense. So I gave it a whirl. And it turned out that I had a natural inclination towards the technological side of digital photography, combined with the creative side of lighting and composition that came together at that time. I was essentially, my voice as a rock star at that moment was just intersected with the luck of digital photography and whatever to get me here. And,
right.
And it's that fear that tells you that was just luck. And you're like, oh no.
Yeah. And it's hard to ignore that little voice. Certainly.
Yeah. Yeah. But you have to. And yeah, it's only in the last, honestly, 2 to 3 years that I felt like this isn't a fluke. And I've been doing this for 15.
Mm-hmm.
So 12 years of thinking this is a fluke and it could end at any moment. That's what it feels like being a creative.
Definitely. Yeah. My industry will change or go away, or younger people are going to know the newest whatever it is, or I'm not keeping up enough with the trends, or I'm not really looking active on social media, which I have to do if it's a lot that kind of haunts you.
Yeah. No. And that's a grind, that pull to publish on social media constantly.
Mm-hmm.
That is, I've outsourced that. Tim handles most of it. And if I'm to in any way acknowledge those who I stand on the shoulders of, that I would completely fall on my face without, my parents, my wife, people like Irvin, Chet, but my studio manager, Tim, just the best person to work with talented, like the best thing that's ever happened to my business after my wife and my parents I could ever imagine. You know, he's incredible and so talented at what he does. So surrounding yourself when you're working creatively with people that are competent, supportive, and won't give you a passing compliment, but will rather say, nah, that keep working on that, or, you know, that will call you out on those things is just so incredibly important.
It really is.
You have to be able to take your own medicine of turning those stones over in collaborating in those moments. And
I try to encourage my colleagues to really get into that. And I think a part of this was drilled into me in art school.
Oh, yeah.
Of the process of critiques, right? Like, oh, well, I really like Susie's photo the best. Not ever going to be good enough in art school. Like, no, why? Why do you like it? Or what do you not like about it? Or why doesn't it do it for you? You know? And so, when people are saying, oh, I love that layout, I love the colors you used, or like, oh, that's great, but if you don't,
thank you, but tell me why.
Yeah, tell me why. And
why?
Also, call me out on my bullshit. Like you kind of phoned that one in.
Right.
It's you played it a little safe there, and that to me, having those honest people, and also like you're saying, creative people is not only my favorite part of my job. Getting to work with you, getting to work with photographers, some of the most talented people, creators in the state, is why I keep doing it and why I love it and why I've despite, probably irrational warning alarms in my head saying, you're in print, get out, go do something else. It's like, this is sort of to me, maybe the dying gasp of print media. And I want to be a part of it. And I want to, see what happens. And, surrounding myself with other creative people is the best way to feed my own process. Always, right. Certainly.
Yeah. How do you involve yourself with creative people, but then also do you involve your creations across the non-creative people to give you the feedback, as in how will this be received experientially rather than critically, because I think that's a really important thing too, because whatever you're doing, you should be aiming at speaking to the entirety of the population to continue to get us to gel as a cohesive thing. And I wonder how that works. Anytime I interact with, I really appreciate interacting with people who are direct, blunt, and don't care about your feelings. I love that. And I mean, people like my old business partner, Caleb, like, we had it out. We separated the business apart. We were just ridiculously angry and mad at each other at points. And like the next week, it was like, what are you doing? I don't know. All right, let's hang out. Okay. That was it. And it was difficult, but it was over when it was over.
Yes.
And the friendship was there. But because of the creative understanding of critical thinking and processing things, it's like we fought for what we needed to fight for, but we understood it through the creative process, and that was done. And we did it. And we did it honestly and moved on, But to keep that within, I don't know. That's some mental wandering there. I don't know where that's going.
Sure. Yeah. Well, where are we at here? Hour and 40 minutes? What do you think? Should we wrap it up?
So if you're getting there, I'm there. I've really enjoyed this. Just well, first of all, my wife told me not to talk the whole time, and I didn't really obey that. But,
sure, I'm kind of glad you did.
But it's really fun to me to just be able to work through this whole thing of creativity, because it is like the opening line I'm trying to work with right now is essentially that we are creation. It's something we're born in. And we do. You just become awake in that cycle. And it's so hard to try and imagine telling someone about something that you embody with every single thing of everything that you do. It's just, and I've dwindled it down to these primary things of love and truth, try to explain what truth is to someone who has no concept of that or love. And that's just to understand, like if you can understand that, it seems like you're able to unlock how things work and just be able for me in understanding that, I feel like I have the process to understand anything. I don't know hardly. And like the more you understand, you realize how little you know. Sure. And it's an adverse, it's like a hydra, the Greek thing where you chop the head off and 7 more come up. It's like you solve a problem and it outlines then 7 more problems that you then need to outline. Like truth is to me a horizontal proposition, in that if you see something that's of question on the horizon, by the time you get to it, there's more things on the horizon. It's just never going to stop. And that's the process of creativity. It was around before us and it's going to keep going, but we're through it. We're kind of, if we can understand the process, we might be able to help outline our origin, our direction, and where we're going and get there more effectively. So
certainly. And stay inspired and challenged and make mistakes. The anecdote I always love, just because it's the most Maine thing you can say, is like a lobster molts its skin,
right,
and it has to grow, and it's apparently a painful, difficult process, and we have to grow in the same way, right? Like if we don't ever put ourselves into uncomfortable situations, we can't grow. So yeah, I think that a lot of what you said is, I'm thinking like, oh man, I'm really guilty of that. Like just taking a staycation because I just feel so like I just need rest,
right?
But really, you need nourishment as well.
Well, I kind of disagree with you there. That those moments of staycation, I think, should happen daily, within your schedule. Like that ability to not have there's no one's in a line anymore. They're just standing looking at their phone until they can do what they want to do. And in those moments before, you had the time to actually process all the stuff that you had the ability to organize all the planes that had landed at your airport. But not now. It's like you put those on hold and you just kind of do this and disengage,
Yeah.
So those moments of just introspection, I think, should be like a daily process. And then the vacation should be like you're experiencing something new that completely adds to your perspective and changes it and grows it. So, yeah, that's my take on it. So.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's wise words.
Well, I'm old, so
yeah, we're all getting old.
But there's an interesting thing: if you're not liberal when you're young, you're heartless, and if you're not conservative when you're old, you're brainless.
Yeah.
And there's such a truth to it, but it's not an inescapable thing. It's just it's a natural progression, but it's not inescapable. And I definitely feel myself embracing more and more reliable behaviors as a means of being conservative, but I do that in the areas where I have no interest. Mm-hmm. Like I have no interest in seeking new territory and the organization of garage barns, but I can create a lot more things in my barn if it's organized. So I just adhere to organizational practices and move on, But yeah, sorry, I'll wander on forever talking. So
no, that's all right.
I have to cut my mic off.
Cool. Well, thank you for the talk. This has been really great.
No, this is really fun. I kind of knew I'd capitalize on the whole thing and talk the whole
time. No. I don't think you did. I felt like I could cut you off, but
good. That's good.
No, it was interesting. It was really good.
Do you guys I remember I pitched this a while ago, but I think it would be such an interesting thing to watch a critique of the proposed layout and everything else of like upcoming issues of Maine Home Design, to like actually get like a video story of the behind the scenes thinking process and everything else. But I know you guys do it on such a schedule that it's like, how are you going to accommodate capturing that anyways?
Yeah, I mean, it is a great idea. The scary truth is, not only is it always such a deadline driven schedule, but it's like so fragilely staffed that it's like, I wish I had like a team to bring in, like, let's throw it up on the wall and do a critique like in the old Manhattan days, and it's really just,
Right.
just slowly over the years, things have become harder for print, and
Yep.
it was, when I started, just doing art direction for Maine magazine, then it was like, Heidi Kern, who I learned a lot from and did Maine Home and Design layouts before me. She left, and they were like, well, maybe you do both of them. I was like, oh, I'll try it for a bit until you find a new person. It was like,
You gonna double my pay?
but so that just kind of stuck, and it's just yeah, it's hard sometimes when you're in a deadline driven industry to take that step back that you have to take, and we don't do enough of that, like critically looking at it. I mean, we do, but it's sort of in these just make sure it's right, make sure it's accurate, and
These more romantic moments of making a deadline. You're not going to be like, hey, you want to come make a story out of this?
yeah,
It'd take a whole production team of forcing you to do something.
right, yeah.
Maybe someday.
Yeah, I mean, video has been such a tricky thing for us. I mean, we had the whole back in the old days, we had like sort of an in-house video team that was doing some great work, and it's, I've taken a crack at it. Was it a success or was it a failure is tough to say. Financially,
It's harder.
it's
more expensive.
hard to make money and have it be great. I worked with a company called Rove Lab.
Yeah.
Gabe and Jay, and
they're Gabe Rubin.
yes,
Yeah, he's insanely talented. I love his stuff.
yeah. I worked with them on a series that we just called The Mainers, and it was incredible, and I had a great time doing it. It was creatively fulfilling and so great to work with them, and then it was like, all right, how do we make money of this now? And it's like, maybe we like take this.
Yeah, because you can't really put an ad really on it. I mean, you could incorporate it into, like, if you developed a huge YouTube channel, but in developing a YouTube channel, you need the world as your audience to actually make it viable. And if you're only featuring Maine, you've already eliminated 99.99% of the population. So it's a hard nut to crack.
So then we tried the other approach, which is like, let's have a sponsor that's part of it, and the problem then becomes, how much skin in the game do they want? And then, how much of your creative process you're throwing away, and is, Gabe Rubin even going to be interested in making that video, so it's been a tough balancing act. And, one thing I've been thinking about is just telling photographers, when you're out, if you do get a little bit of video, just even if it's like a short snippet, send it over, and, we'll use it.
See what we can do
somehow. It's like, but it's not that easy. It's not like, let me just get video.
Yeah, it's
let me just get video while I shoot.
We actually do an approach where we can shoot still and video of a piece of architecture in the same day, but there's no creativity involved in the video. Mm-hmm. It's all embodied in the still photos, and then we just simply add film capture with motion and a little bit of lighting for the existing still image. Essentially, we take out the still camera, put in the video, do a slider, riser, and make sure it's lit nicely, and that's it.
Sure.
And you can do that in that way, but you do about 25% less still images because you're taking up time to add the additional video, and you're not doing audio, you're not doing any interviews or anything else. So that's been effective for some clients, but to just all of a sudden, it's a very different mindset to look at something as a still image compared to a video. Like, you're making it that much more subjective and immersive with sound and movement, not just the still image. Mm-hmm. So it's a really hard thing to do uniquely creative things in the same day that are of such a different nature in how they affect people, that if I ever do something like that, I hire someone to come with me to do the video part of it.
Sure.
Because it's just, I don't have the headspace to think that differently in that moment. If that's if you're trying to capture a story rather than these still images. So yeah, that's always been a hard one to to kind of figure out. Well,
Yeah. I mean, yeah, we're gonna have to figure something out eventually over there, because I mean, it is such an engaging medium. It's everything now.
It's where everything's going.
Right.
And still imagery isn't going to go away, because you can limit exposure, and you can only focus in on the greatest moments of something, and you can control, it's good naked, not bad naked. Bad naked
Right.
is just everything in every situation, to make a Seinfeld reference.
Sure.
But with video, especially with architecture, you have to be very selective in what you're showing, because if you're showing a great space and then you go across a side little hallway dead end thing, it's like, what's that? Why are we looking at that? And so it's a very odd thing, and very difficult to do together, but not
The
impossible.
other problem I found is that what I like and what I personally enjoy just seems so different than what worked in video. I liked these more long form narrative stories, like really diving in, like, yeah, like, Jay, let's make like a 15-minute thing. And it's like, and the internet wants like 30 seconds.
Right.
It is like,
and just move on.
Right.
We've got to get to the point, though, I imagine, where there's going to be a hunger for that eventually.
Mhm.
I think we'll lose it, and it'll come back. We're doing this experiment with social media over the last decade or so, and it's just in so many ways a bad thing, but in so many ways a good thing. So it's
right.
we're figuring it out, and print. It's weird, because I started working right as print was just taking a nosedive.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, luckily, Maine Home+Design, probably at the time, through some fairly predatory practices
Sure.
all the way around, were able to make it successful long enough to then be bought out by a more advocate type of organization.
Sure.
And it transitioning from having that presence of an authority in a state on architecture in a medium that is dying, how do you keep that sustained while the medium that it is in dies? Because you have this presence and this voice, but doing it through physical printed pages financially is going to go the way of the dinosaur, potentially.
Right.
Unless there's something creative in there that we're not seeing, that's an option or whatever. Sure. But how do you stay viable and still the same entity, but reach the same people, but through different media? Because then your experiential interaction totally changes. You're not able to leave it in the restroom and use it that way. Now everyone's in the restroom just flipping through.
Right.
So yeah, that's a weird problem. I wonder where it will go.
Yeah, I mean, and sometimes I think like, oh, we're not working hard enough to solve this problem. But then I see national titles bringing in experts, digital experts or whatever, folding left and right, and it's like if these national titles aren't able to find that creative solution, then maybe it's not that easy. Maybe it's just really and there is, I think, a benefit and a lifeblood to regional titles that national titles don't have.
Well, a lot of the thing I've experienced is that the national publications are fed from the projects that are in regional publications.
Sure. Yeah.
Because I know it's a law you don't break, that if you want to be featured regionally, if you go nationally first, there's a high likelihood the regional publication won't want it because everyone's seen it. But if it's only in a regional publication first, then the national's less likely to say like, well, it's already been featured there, we want to show it. So you can go one way but not the other sometimes. So there's that. But
yeah, it's interesting. It's it's like the holy grail right now. Really is figuring out how to take that status as a tastemaker. And,
right. A gatekeeper. Editors in publications are gatekeepers that approve the creations to then be presented to the whole. Essentially, they act as the conscientious or conservative gatekeeper to present what has been created. And in this current cultural conversation, we have lost basically all gatekeepers. Everyone's their own spitting forth whatever they think. And so you get all of these wild conspiracy theories with no real gatekeepers in established media sources saying this can't go public. This is ridiculous. At the same time, you have far more availability to truth, but good luck discerning what's true.
Oh, I know.
So yeah, it's this dichotomy. There's this weird thing that is unavoidable, but we just have to go through it and figure it out. So
yeah, it really is a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
I remember the early days of the internet. Being a young kid, excited, he knew how to use the internet. My grandfather was a librarian and a Presbyterian pastor, and he said, "Well, you can't trust what you read on the internet." And I was like, "No, like yes, you can, Grandpa." It's like, and here's why, and why, and why. And then it's like, fast forward 22 years later, and like there
Grandpa
are people who have read things on the internet that are so invested in and believe that are correct that it's like, man, I have to think back and like, man, he
Grandpa
was prophetic about that, like, sorry, I was wrong, and, but like you said, I mean, we don't have things like, Black Lives Matter and activations, things like, the Arab Spring, that all of this organized on Facebook and all that much more creation in the world and accessible.
Right.
So yeah.
It's funny because there's so much more to talk about there, and in all of it. Then that's the hard thing I have about trying to write this is that it just keeps it. It's not a path. It's like it's just an ever expand, like a universe. Just you can go everywhere and anywewhere with it. So
yeah, it's a broad topic.
Yeah,
for sure.
I got to say this was definitely fun, and it's very nice to get a different creative's perspective in kind of guiding the conversation. So, I think it could be interesting. Like, I'm sure there's other things that could spawn potentially from an interaction like this that could include even like two people like interacting with a single person to say like two different perspectives, kind of asking questions or whatever. So if you ever want to do anything like this again with additional people or anything else, the whole thing is very, very fun.
Cool.
So.
Good. Yeah, cool. Well, thanks for tuning in, listening to the podcast. And again, be sure to check out Trent's Design Theory in the upcoming August issue of Maine Home & Design. And we'll see you next time.
Hopefully I can write something coherent.
Cool. Is that a good sign off?
Great.
Cool.
Awesome.
Sweet.